Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us at this unearthly hour. It's dark outside, and for our third discussion about London. And on this occasion, we're going to be focusing not on coming out of lockdown, because we've just done it for the second time yesterday, but we're going to focus on some of the things that have happened to our high streets in London, and what can we do about it? What's the issues that are going to be causing us to make changes? And what are the opportunities that we can find to make the high streets really work again for London? It's been a bit of a week for retail. Two of the biggest collapses in the retail sector have finally happened. It's not a surprise, but it's certainly affecting 26,000 people and puts an added dimension. This is not just about buildings. This is not just about shops. This is about people's lives, and they also live in London too. So let me tell you first a bit about Kratos, if you've not heard of us before. We're a specialist local government consultancy providing planning communications, advisory support for local authorities, supporting the creation of new sustainable communities, and providing effective public affairs and public relations campaigns. Our team work nationwide, supported by offices in Southampton, Bristol, Manchester, and of course, London. You're welcome to send us questions, and we will put those into the discussion later on. But now I'll introduce you to our excellent speakers. Jonathan Martin is the Director of Inward Investment into the London Borough of Waltham Forest. He has absolutely used the lockdown situation to further the message about Waltham Forest and why you should go and invest in there by joining us on webinars and being one of the most outstanding ambassadors for his borough and an outstanding team that he represents. So thank you for joining us, Jonathan. Kate Ives, I've worked with over many years, and she's been a pioneer of the development sector. She's embraced the partnership working. She's gone for involving the communities much earlier, and the whole understanding of placemaking has been at the heart of her mission in every job I've ever known her do, way ahead of the buzzwords being used by the sector. Zach Wilcox has a background in local government finance. He better keep that quiet because he might find a lot of people wanting to talk to him. But he is with Arabs, a city economist and a planning associate, and he's going to be giving us a background to some of the facts and figures that are behind the scenes. Our keynote speaker is Councillor Danny Thorpe. Danny has been, for the last few years, the leader of the Royal Borough of Greenwich. I must get it right, it's the Royal Borough. But also, he is part of a new wave of leadership coming into London. And this now is a responsibility that he has for London councils as an executive member of business, Europe, and we will do our hardest not to go anywhere near what that means for him, and good growth for London councils, particularly dealing with the high street situation. So with no further ado, let's go straight into Danny to lead us into this debate.
Thank you very much, Nick, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Nick said most of it. Just for context, I've been a councillor for more years than I care to remember now in Greenwich, and part of my previous roles was as the cabinet member for regeneration for 4 years, where I oversaw some major high street investments, particularly in Eltham and Plumstead, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. I'm just going to share my screen to bring up my presentation, and there we go. So great to be here this morning. As I mentioned, I have been the cabinet member for a long time, and this was me out and about in Woolwich, actually, which is one of our major town centres, and you know, a place of great opportunity and challenge in Woolwich and at the heart of Royal Greenwich. And I think I've also been thinking, as I've come into this London Council's role, about my sort of nostalgic views on the high street. And certainly as a kid, I spent many Saturday morning happily rooting through the pick and mix of the Woolworths Eltham branch. And actually the picture that you see behind me is of Eltham High Street, which is where I live now, in 1920. And I think the really hard thing at the moment about local government is we often talk about these time periods. You know, people say, what do you want your borough to be like in 100 years? What's your vision for Greenwich for 2050? But the high street challenge for all of us is it's absolutely clear that our high streets are going to look completely different in 100 days, let alone 100 years. So in terms of the urgency that we face, it's very real, pressing and urgent. I guess it's really important as well when we get into this to be absolutely clear what we're talking about. I know certainly as leader and as a cabinet member, I had high street conversations that actually were talking not just about high streets, but also about town centres, about neighbourhood shopping parades, about markets and the crucial role that they've played, particularly, I have to say, since the pandemic began. And clearly the interdependencies of all of those that kind of occur. So for those of us who've got retail parks a mile away, the pressure that that places, you know, the challenge now where we have Westfields and sort of global centres within our cities, the threat and the opportunities around major towns, places like Woolwich, like Southall, where we absolutely have to have a different offer in order to attract people. The London plan actually identifies 221 different town centres across London, just under an average of 7 spaces per borough. And I think that represents the scale of the challenge, but it's also fundamentally clear that what a one-size-fits-all model to places that are entirely different really is not going to cut it. And I think really at the moment, we've got so much on in local government. I spend more time at the moment worrying about how I'm going to get the vaccine rolled out and who's going first and how we make all that work than I do necessarily about the high street per se. Clearly jobs and the economic impact is very much at the forefront of what we're doing. But I think we're entering into a space where we have a new and clearer leadership role for local government, but it's fundamentally clear to me that we're not going to be able to do it all by ourselves. Now, obviously, when Nick asked me to do this, I don't think his crystal ball said this would be the worst week for the high street since the war, but that's where we are. And you just cannot escape any of the news about what's going on. I think it's really interesting and important for us to actually dig below the headlines in terms of the scale of the challenge. Now, I think a lot of people are right, actually. Is this about COVID, or has COVID just accelerated what Amazon had already started? And I think, you know, there's a lot to be discussed in there. The collapse of Arcadia alone means that there's 16.5 million square feet of retail space coming back into the market. And in equivalent terms, that's about 6 Westfields. So huge new underused space, which we're going to have to consider the impact of. It's also, you know, I think really important to recognise that given the seismic scale of the changes that we're seeing, it's the things which are falling over that people are missing, which in other days would be huge news. You know, brands like Jaeger, brands like Peacocks, absolutely, you know, huge high street names that have barely got a mention in the context of where we are. And I think the real challenge and the big thing for us to consider is the role of landlords currently, because clearly when Woolworths did fall over, people like Poundland and Iceland came streaming in and took over. But actually, who's going to come in and fill these premises now? I think one of the big challenges for us all is to recognise that the most important thing we need to do is to understand the place, because I think high streets are complex, multifaceted problems. And if we're really honest, it's very rarely just about the offer of the shops that are on the high street, which are part of the problem. This is a piece of work that we're doing currently in Woolwich. Woolwich is a high street heritage action zone, and we're going to be putting in just under £4 million of investment over 4 years. The green strip on your screen actually represents the high street in itself. That's the actual road that people walk down. But we've been looking as a team in Greenwich about what are those other factors which are playing in to the challenge that we have in Woolwich. You know, inactive frontages, to just name a few, poor public realm, a real perception of unsafety, the severance that we have with the main road, and an underutilised market. And actually, it's quite clear to me that we're going to need to deal with all of those things in the whole if we're going to actually make any change. And I'm sure that will be the same for high streets across London. Now, the Kratos motto is "Our world is local," and never has this been more true, with so many people stuck at home and away from the office. I took these two photos this week. So on Tuesday, I went for a walk into London, into the centre. And actually, what I realised when I came back to Woolwich was that there were more people on Powder Street in Woolwich than there were on Carnaby Street. And clearly the Central Action Zone is a huge issue in itself, and one that we won't necessarily have all the time for today, but does require a really specific response. And I think also we do have to recognise that actually gone are the days, I think, when people are prepared to give up their life 4 hours a day with your head stuck up someone's armpit on the Northern Line in order to go back to work. And actually, I think there's real challenges and opportunities around how we connect people to what is on their doorstep. This is some of the work that we've been doing at the moment in Greenwich to actually build community confidence, build community knowledge, and get people back out. So we had a huge campaign called Royal Greenwich It's Time, which was all about local business offers, connecting people into places that probably they just would never ever have noticed. And I think increasingly there's a huge opportunity to do that with people still feeling worried about transport, still feeling actually, you can go into the centre as I did on Tuesday, but there's no theatres open, kind of none of the kind of usual London stuff is currently on offer. So actually, in terms of the boroughs and our individual places, we do have a real opportunity there. Now, I think in terms of the challenge for me in this new role and for all of us is actually kind of exemplified by a couple of these questions. And whilst we can't change the weather of this country, and God, we'd love to at the moment, actually we can create the right conditions for growth. And in terms of the high street, this is urgent work for all of us. We've seen not just the impact of a pandemic, but also the impact now of totally devastating decisions, for example, around the curfew. It's fundamentally clear that business rate reform is absolutely essential and will be moving forward. But actually our planning processes are also in real need of overhaul in regards to the high street. If I spoke to any of my planners in Greenwich, they would tell me eloquently and passionately that the decisions they were taking were to protect the high street, and they firmly believe that. We lost out on a major high street brand food chain a couple of years ago because planners refused to give permission to combine 2 shop units into one, which would have increased the floor space available. It would have been a brand that people absolutely loved, and in many ways a kind of game changer for the high street. But I think it just exemplified to me the huge challenge that we have. And it's also the unintended consequences of other legislation. So all of us are deeply immersed in solving and responding to the climate emergency at a local and a regional level. But Lidl's installed 7 solar panels, 7 stores worth of solar panels, and saw their business rates increase by 585% as a result. And actually, that just cannot be right. Lots has been spoken about public realm, and I just want to talk to you about a few things that we've done in Greenwich to change the public realm in and around our high street. So we'll start on the left-hand side. These were some of our resident rainbow trees that we created during the pandemic. Actually, all of the little dangly things that you can see are messages that residents sent in that were thank yous to particular individuals and organisations that had helped them. Actually, at a time when people were feeling fearful to come out, it did create footfall on the high street. It did bring people back out into our town centres. The second image there in the middle is some of our pride crossings. I was really proud that we did 8 pride crossings this year, actually all sponsored by private organisations, which I think is a great opportunity for us to engage with business, but also to recognise the different communities that live in our boroughs. And I really love this one because the Wetherspoons behind you was actually burnt down in Woolwich during the London riots, and actually featured, I think, about 5 days later on the news, because certainly at that time we didn't have many Guardian journalists living in Woolwich. But actually, the amount of grief that I got for doing this, and people saying, you're going to have trouble, it will cause all sorts of issues. not a word, no adverse reaction to that at all. And on the right-hand side isn't Washington, but it's actually Woolwich. And when Black Lives Matter unfolded and I think people became truly aware of the scale of the challenge, we talked quite extensively about public realm and what we were doing. This is our main town square in Woolwich, General Gordon Square, and clearly now with those contested histories and different perspectives about names, we decided to put Black Lives Matters right the way across the square. It's absolutely huge, was sponsored by Rhineys. And again, actually we got a lot of online abuse, but in real terms, it did bring people out, it did bring people back, and fundamentally we're using the public realm to send a message about the kind of values that we want. And finally, I think culture has an absolutely huge role to play in terms of our high streets and potential regeneration. And I know obviously Waltham Forest have really led the way as the London Borough of Culture, who did incredible work across the borough. This is Woolwich High Street again. This was our Woolwich suffragette, and we did a piece of work about on the 100 years of suffrage about the women of Woolwich. And some of those there are with their placards and their names, and we brought their stories to life. And this was a procession through the high street. And you know, whilst some people may look at this and think, oh, this is nice, but kind of what's the point? Well, actually, the economic value of culture to boroughs and to places is absolutely huge. And it's quite clear, I think, that regardless of how quickly we get this vaccine out, venues in themselves are going to be challenged to moving forward. So there is a massive opportunity to provide culture to people. And I think at this point, a desperate need for it. So I think when I spoke to someone yesterday and said, you know, kind of, are you going to go shopping ever again? And they said, why would I? I'm never going to buy a suit again in my life. Actually, we need to think about what's going to get someone like that back to the high street. And it's not going to be retail, but it may be an experience or an engagement opportunity. So just finally, this is a group of people in Plumstead in our new centre that we opened, Plumstead High Street, not your traditional high street, very local, very multicultural. And actually it took 5 years of work to get the council funding to reinvest and recreate proper 21st century public services on the high street, a new civic centre. This was a week before the pandemic really kicked off. So it's been absolutely testing and a real shame to miss out on the opportunity that I think a great £20 million local government-led investment in your high street generates. But actually, when I think about our high street, our new mission from London Councils of our High Streets for All work, it's absolutely clear that we're all going to be required to work together and contribute to this aim. So I'm looking forward to working with many of you moving forward and look forward to taking questions. Thanks, Nick.
Great. No, that's brilliant, Danny. And Zach, let's just move into some of the background. I think we actually got some amazing stats there, actually. 16 million square feet of space coming back into the market, 6 Westfields. Holy moly, that's changing the whole thing. What else can you shed a light on for us?
Yeah, that's fine. No, that's a tough act to follow. Thanks, Danny. We've already touched on the point that COVID-19, as with most economic shocks, is actually exacerbating the changes in retail and town centers that they had already been facing. So we all heard about Arcadia yesterday, who have 450 stores across the UK. But most people don't know that they had already closed 100 stores and cut thousands of jobs since 2018 because of some of the challenges that they were facing. Meanwhile, online-focused retailers have had sustained growth pre and during the pandemic. So the broader challenge is how retail and indeed offices alongside that will adapt and the impact that will have on our city centers and high streets. So I'm going to talk about 3 key areas. And despite being from the American South, I'm going to talk as quickly as possible to share the information. I want to talk about the impact of retail on town centers and how that's varying quite widely, but structural change has been sped up. I'm going to quickly talk about better data to plan for change. but the real focus will be on ideas for trialing, adapting, and evolving our places. So again, I've said that the impact on retail and town centers has been uneven. There's a really good bit of research out from Center for Cities, my former employer, about the impact of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. And they found that it had a much smaller impact on larger cities. It was only 8% increase in London month on month. But had a much bigger impact in smaller cities, which saw about a 15 to 20% uplift. And that's where tourism and easy access to the town center made it easier to return and had improved kind of perceptions of safety of travel. Our major urban centers have seen much larger decreases in footfall. So in September this year compared to last year, the New West End Company said 56% decrease in footfall. Meanwhile, suburban centers have done comparatively better. Retail parks only saw about a 10%, 10.5% decrease year on year. And some of the shopping center locations in high street saw about a third drop. So our core urban centers are the ones that are really struggling at the moment, which makes sense because it's the opposite pendulum swing of their success during economic boom times. So we really have this mixed story where suburban centers and high streets are facing different challenges and they need to adjust and adapt in different ways than the central activity zone. And for the latter, reasons to travel farther into town and making sure that commuting feels and is safe are added challenges, as well as bringing workers safely back to the town center. So I want to talk about one way that we've used data to help, and we worked with Surrey County Council. And what we did is we kind of gathered as much quality data as we could to try and tell many different stories about what was happening in their place. So we used the BICS data from ONS, which is about the impact of COVID. We used PwC, Center for Cities data. We used footfall data, kind of a whole range to spatially consider the impacts on businesses and on residents. Looking at which sectors might be negatively impacted or which ones might be growing, where there might be increased claimant counts or furloughed employees, to identify not just sectorally, but spatially where the big hotspots and challenges. That's really helping them think about kind of focusing on intelligence, where they were before COVID, how things are changing during COVID, and what they might want to consider for their next move. From that work, though, kind of the key point we wanted to get across was that decline is not inevitable. There's a lot of things that policymakers, developers, and other partners can do to revive and restore our town centers. We did a really interesting piece of work with our colleagues in Melbourne because we realized that they were going through their winter COVID while we were going through our summer COVID, and we probably had some things to learn from each other. And one of the biggest lessons was about lighting and the importance of lighting during winter months to make people feel safe and to bring them back into town centers. And it's not just about lighting a square, which is really brilliant for placemaking and showing off your heritage assets, but also making sure that all these great bike lanes and walking routes that we put into our high streets feel safe and are well lit, and our bus shelters are well lit in order to bring people back in safely. But some of my kind of more pertinent examples for what I want to talk about now, there are three key areas. It's about engaging with your town center, adapting your town center, and evolving your town center. When I say engaging, it's about bringing people back in where it's safe and appropriate. So sponsoring events to attract people back in. There are ideas about boosting business ahead of the Christmas period with window shopping in town centers and encouraging people to buy online from local retailers. And in Melbourne, they instituted a return to workplace pledge where the local health authority worked very closely with bosses and companies to make sure that they felt safe and knew that they had the measures in place to bring the workers back into our town centers. To bring that kind of downstream footfall that supports the retail and the food and beverage and the leisure offer. And then it's about how do we adapt once we bring those people in, expanding outdoor dining opportunities through different changes to licensing is incredibly important. I'm pushing the BYOB, bring your own blanket for outdoor eating and drinking during the winter months. But in the longer term, that's going to require changes to the way our licensing and planning teams work together, which Danny touched on a bit. We've also seen suspending fees for street trading permits to encourage more outdoor, safer shopping. and enlivening vacant shop frontages, and providing financial support for that to make sure that high streets feel lively, even if the shops aren't necessarily full. And then lastly, thinking about how we evolve in the longer term, partnership working is going to be required to hedge risk and make money go farther. There's, again, another really great program from our colleagues in Melbourne called the Shopkeeper Program, which brought together owners, landlords, banks, and retail associations to encourage and enable creative small businesses, community services, and social enterprises back into occupy vacant shops. And what's exciting about that is then local authorities, in playing a greater role, have more potential to influence more inclusive and sustainable places in their high streets. Flexible planning and licensing will be incredibly important. There's a new piece of research out that we did with the GLA on mean well uses, and we found that the tension between planning, licensing, and the confidence to invest was the biggest challenge in taking mean well uses that really worked and making them sticky assets within communities that could drive social value. There is some promising changes with the new use class changes that were enacted in September, which will give more flexibility and present opportunities to increase the resilience of high streets. And then lastly, there's a really great program that some retailers have been developing called Retrain for Revamps. That actually takes people who have been working in the shop floor and gives them digital skills to help with their online presence as well, so that they can retain both online and retail presence and adapt in the way that some of the more successful businesses have. So kind of in sum, decline is not inevitable, but change is. While development may be stalled or business may be less certain, investing in people and place is going to be the most important thing for reviving our town centers. And in order to do this, we need to anticipate those challenges through better data and intelligence, test and trial new things, not be afraid to do that and be a bit flexible, and to make those positive changes sticky.
Wow. Okay, Jonathan, I want you to answer all of those things in a minute, but first let's drill down into one specific sector. Kate, the whole economics of the high street is up in the air. We've got used to shops being built, 25-year leases. How is the development community able to come in and help us change the high street, not just visually and other things, but actually change the economics of how things are funded to change the way that people operate?
So thanks, Nick. And some really, really great statements there. Decline is not inevitable. I absolutely subscribe to that, but change absolutely is. And I come at this from a sort of a residential regeneration developer perspective, which you might say, oh, well, what's that really got to do with the high street and, you know, the culture and placemaking? But actually it's got everything to do with it, because from an investment point of view, which is what we do, we invest in buildings and places. We need to make sure that those investments are wise and are safe. And one of the things we always look at is, what is the quality of the high street? What is the quality of the place? And what are the sorts of interventions that we can make to support our investment in the residential housing? So it's not the only factor. There are a lot of other factors that go into it, but you know, it is absolutely true. Residential developers are fundamentally interested in where people shop, how people get to work, how they're going to afford to buy the homes that we're building. So I think this is a question of housing as much as it is a question of retail. And if we look at some of the areas that are put into question here, we have to ask ourselves about the quality of the mix of uses that's happening in some of these places, and whether we've actually created a sustainable ecosystem in those particular geographies. So for us, it's also about jobs. People definitely need jobs. And so we use our housing as effectively an opportunity to support local authorities creating jobs. And that's not just through the construction supply chain. It's actually through thinking about how we can use the retail spaces in our developments to support local people into jobs. So when we build, retail or commercial space that might sit below a high density building, we don't say to ourselves, how much value can we get out of that through selling that retail space? We actually look at that and say, how can we use this to support and enhance our offer to the local community? I'll give you an example of that. one of the things that we try to do very early on, before we've even built the space, is work with local councils and run pop-up business schools. So the idea here is that local people can come to one of our pop-up business schools. They run for a 2-week period, and individuals or existing small businesses learn about how to manage their tax affairs, how to undertake digital marketing. There's obviously a lot of collaboration as well, how to write a business plan, how to get bank funding. And so it's a very supported context with people who are all learning together and, you know, locally concentrated, to start thinking about how they move their business from outside of their front room, if you like, and into a more public facing context. And then we use our buildings, because we say, look at all of this fantastic energy and vitality that's sitting here. How can we use our building to support them into a retail or commercial environment? So we effectively create curated, affordable workspace so that they can take their next stepping stone on that effectively sort of retail or commercial ladder into that space. And we create lively front doors to our schemes. And selfishly, absolutely selfishly, what that gives us is a beautiful entrance to our brand new building. And people who come to buy our homes don't see hoarded up shop fronts. They actually see places that they want to live, and they can see themselves in that space, and they can feel community spirit, and they can feel the local agenda. So to me, for residential developers, the retail space is just as important as the quality of the worktop in the kitchen and the, you know, the green space and the play spaces and things like that. And I think we're now at a place where it was easy to ignore this before as a residential developer, but I don't think we can anymore, because people do have choices now about where they can buy. And we've all seen that the quality of the placemaking that happens actually can enhance our returns as a developer. So there's a purpose to investing, but there's also a purpose for us working with local councils from a regen perspective to help their communities grow their, you know, enhance the sort of economic development side of things that's happening when we bring big schemes forward. So to me, it's about that curated approach. It's about that local approach that we can drive, but it's about controlling it as well. So rather than pass it on to sort of retail owner of old, we're going to control that and look after that ourselves, because we're actually invested in it through the residential that sits above that. And I think for me, part of this is also about thinking about how the COVID recovery point, and we've got to be healthier. We've got to be more local, and we've got to hold our feet to the fire and be more sustainable while we're going about this change. This is actually not a negative point in time. It's completely an opportunity, because now is the time when we're all energized to make some great change. So let's harness that energy and actually invest in all these brilliant ideas, be it culture or leisure, or changes to the planning system, changes to how we finance schemes, changes to how we partner with each other, in order to make sure that we keep that objective of creating not just healthy high streets, but healthy places and healthy communities. Because I don't think there's ever been an opportunity like there is now to actually get it right, and get it right consistently for the future. So, you know, no more big boxes is the other thing I'd like to say.
Great. Well,
In
look,
conclusion.
no, I think that's brilliant. And you've always been forward thinking, and I love the business schools that you put together for helping people, because that's one of the big barriers, the confidence that you can actually put together a business and run it behind the scenes.
Yep.
Jonathan, so we've heard there's some barriers, and some of those barriers are local authorities. So what are you doing in Waltham Forest to remove those barriers as you go out and get the investment coming in? And what are you thinking about the opportunities that you're seeing?
It's a very good question, Nick. Good morning, everybody. The one thing I've noted about being an employee of Waltham Forest is that you can see the inside workings of a local authority, as well as being a resident of a different borough, and see how it feels to be a resident of a local authority. And Waltham Forest has really taken that purchase around how do you remove a barrier? You have to listen. We've moved from being a local authority that provided 22 or 23 services pre-pandemic into one that delivers a far more focused offer of around between 11 to 12 or so services, which are required and necessary to act as an economic recovery agency, a response agency. So what does that mean in terms of what the borough needs to do? We need to demonstrate leadership. We have a very strong leadership in Councillor Coghill, the leader, the cabinet, and also the conviction they have to embrace growth. So always answering your question that I intend to, Nick, what do we do to address that barrier? We listen to our residents. So we've recently engaged with 11,000 residents to understand what it is they want us to do. That has led to us preparing a new internal and external facing document, our public service strategy. The one first objective that everyone's looking at is jobs. We've got a large number of residents who have been furloughed, and we've got to understand how we can get those people back into jobs. We've got to understand how we can provide that public sector role of facilitating that jobs pipeline. That's something that's seen as a key and core objective for us. So again, in listening, what did we do? We had to make sure that we listened to our businesses and our high streets. So yesterday we held our first business summit, and that's where we invited in the businesses of the borough to talk to our leader, our senior executive, including our chief executive, Martin Eastham, about what they wanted to see, give feedback, understand the hardships they've been through in terms of certainly lockdown 1 and obviously now lockdown 2, and start to shape a co-created answer. For us, that's really significant because we're not just going to leave it there as one talking shop. It's never going to be that for us. It's always got to be about action. So in the new year, we're going to have a follow-up summit, which will be a job summit. And that will start to shape how we can evidence what we've heard, how we've listened, and what we plan to do in talking to our businesses that are employers, but also our residents that will be looking for jobs themselves, and how we can broker that position. So that's removing a major barrier in terms of one of the major impacts, as we can see from the pandemic, which is loss of jobs, loss of livelihood and income, massively important for us. What else can we do in terms of being a leadership focused borough? Public realm, absolutely important for all that we've seen in terms of the way we've had to pivot from where we were as local authorities to where we are now. There's been a big focus around what we can do to remain relevant. So we're being relevant to business, we're being relevant to our residents, and we're being relevant around how we can broker a much healthier environment for our residents to stay in, but also to live in and work in. So how are we doing that? We decided to look at two things: an economic recovery action plan, which we launched in the summer, and also a high street action plan, which gets into the actual nuts and bolts of what we're going to do to support our economy. We're an economy of about 10,000 businesses pre-pandemic, and about 40% of those businesses are what we call the kind of essential everyday business, everyday economy. So they're the kind of places we saw Danny talking about earlier, where people go to their high streets to get their everyday shopping. 1,800 of our businesses are in town centres. And we've got about 8 in the borough, of which we're focusing on 5. So again, these are key because we've also got lots of high streets and ribbon high streets we need to embrace. What are we doing to help them in terms of that recovery as the action plan? We've worked with them in terms of how we can deal with the immediacy and urgency of now. So we've distributed and deployed almost £50 million of grant that's largely come from the government. We've also looked at business rates, and we've done around £35 million worth of business rates help through working with our businesses and our economic teams. So we're giving help where we need it as soon as we possibly can. There's new funding coming out, and again, we're working on those as we speak to make sure we can deploy those swiftly. Feedback from yesterday, we've got to be quick. The businesses we're talking to, they're not looking to 6 months time, they're looking to survive now so that they can then talk about 6 months from now. So we've got to pivot, we've got to deploy our resources and our focus now. It's not about strategizing. You can strategize as well, but we've got to put in place tactics and then the action plans to make that happen. Reopen. We've got to reopen our high streets. We've done it twice now. Majorly important in terms of how we start to work with the public realm. How do we make it more inviting for people to actually want to go there as an experiential activity? So we've worked heavily with our highways team, our town centres team, particularly around Enjoy Waltham Forest, which is our cycling initiative, getting people back into those town centres without the need of a car. So there's lots of highways that are being improved in the borough. 30 kilometres has been installed over Waltham Forest, Panborough, to get people onto their cycles and walking on foot. The significance of that is we're also looking at how we can do zero emission deliveries. So again, that's through using potentially pedal cycles rather than vehicles. It's keeping that whole focus around improving the environment. Air quality has been key. So we've had to embrace how we can improve the air quality in these town centres. We've transferred some of that public space into space for plazas. So you can put the shop tables out, you can put the outside dining. Obviously not brilliant this time of year, but certainly when it's not raining, you can get out there and walk around and feel a bit more open and connected. We've invested in things like Walthamstow Wetlands, which is a 211 hectare natural operating wetlands. Working with partners such as Thames Water, massively important for us. So we're keen to drive on that. In terms of reimagining where we are, we've had to reimagine the high streets. It's got to be done because we've seen a number of the shops that we've got close. We're seeing it daily. We've had to work with landowners, some of which are distant, and we've had to engage them from afar to bring them in to see the benefit of pop-up shops. Support local, hyper local. We've gone into a lot of promotional work around signposting where our businesses are, how we can help them in terms of the online presence, because clearly they're looking at issues around staffing. We've had to work with them in supporting them around social distancing to make sure these businesses can trade safely and encourage and welcome people back in. What else are we doing? We're sort of targeting how we can work with a number of other partners, our investment sector, particularly on how we're pushing our schemes through the planning process to make sure that as the new schemes come forward, we can bring forward ideas that give you that meanwhile use. We've got things like Crate St James, which is in St James, part of Walthamstow, where it's a pop-up. It's there on the basis of about a 5-year license. But what we're looking at is the animation it's given to that location. It's injected new investment into that area, and it's supported residents in terms of new investment up and down that high street. So it's massively important for us. I think, again, finally, just around what we're looking to do to try and embrace these barriers and move them out of the way. It's around maintaining, as I've said before, the ability to listen to what our businesses need, what our occupiers and shop owners need. And that's meant setting up various networks, a network of networks, so that we can actually listen and engage with them on a regular basis. Critically important for us, primarily because we're looking to support them going forward, but also embracing things such as the climate emergency. And again, we're working with lots of our businesses and our shops around more sustainable delivery, around more sustainable businesses. We were the first borough to declare a climate change emergency commission. And the outcome of that will be declared in the next few months in terms of the action plan. So these are things we're really keen to support, basically, Nick, moving those barriers into action plans, but also making sure that as we work through each of these stages of the recovery, we can get into the reimagine and how we start to pivot, not just as a local authority in this new public realm and also this new public service that we have to generate, but also how we listen and better respond to the needs of our residents. That's a really potted history. I could also throw in things like how we're engaging with culture and so forth as well, but I'll leave that potentially for the questions.
Jonathan, that's brilliant. Danny, you've got this overarching role now. So brilliant that you've used your own borough to sort of identify some of your thinking. But Jonathan's always knocks me out. It's a like what you're doing in Greenwich, fast moving, fast reacting. COVID stripped away a bit of a joke, hasn't it? In that local authorities, a bit slow to change, where you, in fact, overnight you created services out of nothing. Overnight you moved everything online. I have to say it was breathtaking, the transformation in local government, and it sort of stripped away that whole thing of, well, councillor, we'll plan it. Actually, you can do things fast, and it can be quite dynamic. You know, COVID is sort of, we've got high expectations. Across London, do you feel that all the local authorities are focused on this issue that we're talking about today and are as committed as what we're hearing from you and Jonathan? Or is there more work to be done in your role to get London on board with this swift movement that is needed?
Thanks, Nick. My mind had just drifted actually. I think it was about 6 or 7 weeks ago, I managed to get up to Waltham Forest and meet Claire for a few cheeky beers at the Heathcote Arms, which feels like a world away from where we are today. But I think number one, certainly the pandemic has made it easier to work across London because actually, aside from being kind of responsible and focused on our individual places, I think we as a group of leaders feel that sort of heavy responsibility from across the political divide to kind of respond and move forward. The pace at which we're working, I have to say, is completely unprecedented. And I mean, this is my I think this is my third day working from home, and I'm leaving to go into the office straight after here, because people have taken really different approaches to that, and that's also been interesting. But I think wherever you look in whatever part of London, the visibility of the councils and of the leaders has been astronomical, and that's partly because I think government communications have just been so terrible that people are genuinely sort of looking for local people to trust in this context. The big challenge that we do face, and particularly after the spending review, is we have to be completely honest about the impact of austerity, and that's why I said right at the start that at the moment most of my time is spent working out the vaccination plan with colleagues, not just in Greenwich but across our part of South East London, from Lambeth down to Bexley, and there are real pressures. For example, around distribution of business rate grants and other things, where some boroughs have done really, really well and got the money out of the door as quickly as possible. Others have struggled because parts of those teams have been decimated after 10 years, and that's just a fact. So we're going as fast as we can and doing what we can. And I think probably there's a January conversation about how councils are operating in the new world.
Yeah. And it will start to change. I think that vaccinations, it's not going to happen instantly, but there will be a transition by midway through the year when the pandemic is moving to a management role that's different, and you can focus on these bigger issues. I want to deal with a couple of questions. Mark Jenkinson asked about technology on the high street. I thought technology was the thing that was causing the problem with a big part of the high street, but can technology actually help on the high street in supporting it? And the role of different is different for different centres, which I think we talked about, and the different areas, the central activity zones and everything else that's going on. Can technology and the sustainable sort of technologies come in and really make a difference, do you think, Danny?
Yeah, absolutely. So down in Greenwich, we are working closely we've set up something called Digital Greenwich, and basically we've got a smart mobility lab that's kind of testing out some of these technological solutions in real time in an urban environment. So, for example, we've piloted. We've gone from retrofitting diesel waste vehicles into electric, and actually, as you're attempting to make town centres kind of cleaner places, actually changing your fleet and the way you do some of those things can be, small changes that will have a massive impact. I think, the kind of the future of transport and how we move around the city is very much up for debate in the context of LTNs and kind of what's happened, but just going on as we were is clearly not an option. And I think actually, you are seeing now certainly, in places like Greenwich where we've got that, in places like Waltham Forest, which have led the way in terms of the work that they've done around transport sustainability, real change on the ground. But digital solutions which are human solutions. I grew up with the Jetsons, so I've been forever disappointed that we're not flying about in little environmentally friendly vehicles, and I guess we're a long way from that. But there are absolute real world changes which are happening, and local councils across London are a part of.
Okay, thank you. Kate, Michael asked about how to engage and involve the local communities in revitalising their high streets. You've always been fantastic at digging into those community groups and bringing them out and getting them to talk. This is a great opportunity, isn't it, to have those big conversations like never before?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the format has to change. Gone are the days where if you wanted to have a conversation with a local community, you roll up into a room with some biscuits and a couple of boards and ask people what they think. No one wants to do that. Developers and the community don't want to do that. So it's not the way to do it. But we love a little bit of innovation. I guess to the technology point, some of the sort of things that we do is actually work with a really wide group of people. So recently we went into a local school and we said to the children, we sort of organized a Minecraft session with the architects of a scheme and said, look, please design the scheme. Tell us what you think the vision for this place should be. And so the children got to learn about architecture, engineering, and design. So we were raising their aspiration because it was in an area of deprivation. But at the same time, they were telling us what's really important to them. And it was things like, we want good play space because that sort of red, blue, and green thing isn't very nice anymore. And can we have some trees? And we love riding our bikes, and all the things that we know we really need to put into these new communities actually came from them. The inspiration comes directly from the children. And I think if we can harness that energy and the vision of the children, and if we can harness technology, then we're kind of killing two birds with one stone there, aren't we? Which is great.
I love the idea actually, because Minecraft, my son does it all the time, and he tells you about the houses he's built, and they're just spectacular. I'd like one of them. Yeah.
So we do a lot of that, but we also do lots of other programs as well, where we run design charrettes, and we get everybody in the room and we say, right, here's a pen, draw. Let's actually do this together, and let's vision the future. And where we've got big ideas that come out that aren't quite viable, we actually help the communities work through, well, that's not quite possible, but actually this could be possible. And so we actually talk about what we can do rather than what we can't do, but we do it through a solution-based approach.
I think that's brilliant. I want to go to Zach. Amanda Taylor has asked a question about the talk about scalability and the high streets in the northern towns suffering from high levels of deprivation, and town centres in the Welsh and the former mining and the steel towns, and discussing sort of land values. But actually that's applicable to London, isn't it? Because there are some parts of London that really struggle on land values, deprivation. We've still got all this levelling up. We've still got a big issue in London to keep working on, even though we've been doing good work for the last 10 years. So Zach, how does that work for London? And actually answering Amanda about the north as well, because let's help the north.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you gave me this one actually. So the main hat that I'm wearing at the moment is providing services for the 100 Towns of Government's Towns Fund program. So kind of we see kind of 100 examples on a daily basis of towns trying to figure out how to navigate this process on a day-to-day basis. And I think much of what we are talking about is scalable and not necessarily at high cost. I think right now the real value is in partnership working between the public and private sector and getting that engagement and understanding where there are maybe non-monetary ways to manage risk or provide value. So there'll be kind of there will always kind of be this residual challenge of attracting investors into smaller towns or maybe some of the struggling towns that we have in the country, but that's a consistent market failure that requires kind of a larger response. But if we're trying to talk about like what do we do in the meantime, I mentioned this meanwhile use report that we put out with the GLA, and I'll pop the link in the chat in a second if I can. But what we found is that there's a way to focus on social value and sustainability in meanwhile uses that doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money, but can actually drive a lot of wider economic value for our places. And it's not just wholly focused on kind of land values and property values. But that requires being able to sell the value of temporary uses and bring back footfall to property owners in the long term. And also, wherever possible, leveraging partnerships such as bids where they exist can be really, really important. The last thing I'll say about the land value side is that there are some kind of welcome changes coming through in the Green Book review that came out last week. Time means nothing to me in a COVID world. But kind of the enhanced focus on fitting in with regional strategies and plans, and not just looking at land value uplift in the traditional way, but thinking about wider social and environmental value within business cases. I think all of that is promising for changing the landscape, as well as the business rates reform that we've also been talking about, which I could talk everyone's ears off. But I think in the meantime, that testing and trialing, finding affordable ways to do things in the short term and see what sticks and what works is probably the most scalable and affordable way that we can tackle the immediate challenges.
Right, that's brilliant. I want to go to someone else. I'm going to ask Jonathan a question, but we just talk about the reform to the business rates. that's an area where it's got to be London councils taking that to government, isn't it? Because there is a big issue now where the business rates as a proportion of turnover of some of the high street shops is just out of sync. And Amazon are delivering, they've just employed, which is fantastic to Amazon. They've taken on 400,000 people worldwide. They're growing, they're expanding, but they're not contributing to the taxation base that the shops are being asked to contribute. Is that one of your big things that you can pick up, Danny, in your central role?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we are working very closely with the mayor and with government really to articulate those asks, and as well as sort of fundamental reform. We're asking for an immediate extension of business rates holidays, and those are due to end, I think, in March 2021. And part of the challenge at the moment that we've got with a lot of this legislation is number one, you get huge holes where people are falling through the gaps in terms of who's eligible for what support. But certainly in terms of building consumer confidence, we've got the short-term kind of approach to it isn't really working. We're also working, for example, to do lobbying around VAT retail export schemes and the whole challenge around that. I'm trying not to mention the B word, but it is a significant factor in this context as well, because I think when we finished lockdown yesterday, or today, whether it was, time, as Zach said, time is not our friend anymore. I think we've got about 8 working days to go to prepare a city and indeed a country for a new system potentially, but no one knows what it is. So it's definitely one of the asks in the context of a big lot.
Danny, I think that you've just done a remarkable job of fitting in Europe without saying the word properly, and look at the reaction to it. Just so, you know, another disaster? No, don't worry about it. We'll all cope. Jonathan, been asked by Trevor, is the development time frame work out of sync with the social change? Is that the whole issue of dramatic change? You're trying to manage it, but how tough is it to manage? And, you know, is there more that we've got to do as a whole community?
I think that's a really good question, Nick. And I think certainly in terms of that challenge and that tension, we're looking at it as a borough in terms of 2 opportunities. It's now our time to listen to what our residents and that social change is and what they want to see, but we also need to prepare for the future as a long-term custodian of the local authority area that we administer. So for us, there's 2 things we're looking at. One is the immediacy of now, how we're dealing with the social change around people's choice, and that choice is actually impacting us as employees, residents as well, but also how we can start to give confidence to our residents, to our businesses, and to, importantly, the investment sector around investing in these areas. As was said earlier, and I think Kate touched on it, high streets are always very important in terms of getting across the state of a place. What is it like in terms of that pride of place? We're working on effectively bringing forward our £500 million capital investment strategy, which we signed off at Cabinet in the summer. That effectively means we've got to work with the private, the public sector, the third sector to deliver a lot of new homes and a lot of new jobs, 27,000 new homes and over 8,000 to 10,000 new jobs going forwards. But within that, there's got to be that public sector realm. There's got to be that place shaping. And in terms of the tensions and the time frame, people want to live in a much better environment in terms of air pollution, in terms of how they can walk their neighborhood. So the 15-minute walkable neighborhood is something we've been working on as an action plan to make it real, to make it something that people can tangibly benefit from. What does that mean for investors? It means that the public realm investment we'll put into these town centres and high streets will give them the comfort that when they bring their products, their new homes, their new jobs to an area, it's well supported with a supportive neighbourhood. Love neighborhoods. There's loads of these love neighborhood groups. And again, that's how we engage with them to make sure they're buying into the actual vision. We're co-creating these locations. So we think it's about that co-creation. We believe it's about the long-term role that the local authority has to play with the immediacy and urgency of now.
Well, look, that's brilliant. Michael has said on the chat, communities need a stake in the partnership for their town centres. And actually, that's what I'm hearing right across all of your contributions. So thank you so much, Danny, for triggering this webinar. The problem with really good guests is you could just go on and on because there's such good information coming out. So Kate, thank you so much for contributing your insight, as ever, thrilling. We need to find a site that we can work on together. We will. Jonathan, inspiring and mesmerizing all the way through this pandemic and how you've been promoting Waltham Forest. Zach, thank you for being our deep background on all the economics. And Danny, you've got no small job ahead of you at all on this issue, let alone we'll get you back about Europe, we'll get you back about the business side. I think that your London Council's roles are going to keep you well busy. And you also have one of the most important boroughs for us and for a lot of us who have loved Greenwich ever since our first school trip there. You have a very privileged job there in looking after Greenwich. So thank you all very much. I'd like to thank Jake, Verity and Sean for helping us put together the webinar from the company. We have 2 more webinars before Christmas. One is a special one, which will be on the 14th of December. Look out for the advisory on that. Please join us. And then we have the Creators Christmas webinar on the 16th, which will be just a little bit gossipy, a little bit fun, and a bit naughty looking back on the year. So please join us again. Have a good Thursday, and thank you for joining us. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.